The funny thing is, the fight that changed my neighborhood forever started over a little chalkboard that barely came up to my knee. 3 weeks later, that same fight had people feeding $20 bills into a parking kiosk sitting right outside my neighbor's driveway, and every single dollar they paid was completely legal. If you told me that was how the story would end, I probably would have laughed. But sometimes the people who are obsessed with controlling everyone else end up building the trap they fall into themselves. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 59 years old. I've lived in the same little cul-de-sac outside Franklin, Tennessee for almost 13 years. And if you ever stopped by my house on a Tuesday morning, chances are you'd hear more barking than talking. I run a small dog grooming business out of my converted garage. Nothing fancy, just me. A couple of stainless steel tubs, a grooming table, shelves full of shampoos, and regular customers who've been bringing me their dogs for years. I never wanted a storefront. I liked working close to home, liked walking into my kitchen for lunch, liked hearing birds instead of traffic. The county approved everything before I ever opened. I had permits, inspections, insurance, zoning approval. Honestly, more paperwork than anyone should ever need just to wash golden retrievers for a living. Most of my customers lived within 10 minutes, and after more than a decade, I knew almost every dog by name before I remembered the owners. The little chalkboard sitting beside my walkway wasn't even meant to attract strangers. My daughter Emily painted it for me on my 56th birthday. She'd spent an entire weekend decorating the border with little paw prints and tiny flowers because she knew I'd never spend money buying a real business sign. Across the middle, she wrote Daniel's Dog Spa in bright yellow paint, and every Monday morning, I'd erase the old message and write something silly underneath. Sometimes it said free belly rubs included. Sometimes it said fresh treats today. The neighborhood kids always laughed when they walked by on their way home from school. The board sat between 3 lavender pots and a ceramic water bowl where customers' dogs could get a drink before heading home. It looked welcoming. It looked harmless. Apparently, that was the problem. About 15 months before everything happened, a woman named Vanessa Holloway bought the brick house directly across from the shared curve in our cul-de-sac. At first, everyone welcomed her. We brought casseroles, introduced ourselves, even helped her unload a few heavy boxes. Looking back, I think we mistook confidence for kindness. Within a month, she'd started measuring people's grass, complaining about garbage cans being visible for an extra hour after pickup, and lecturing teenagers because their basketball bounced too loudly on Saturday mornings. She somehow managed to make every conversation feel like she was issuing citations instead of saying hello. She wasn't on the HOA board, but she acted like she was the unpaid sheriff of the entire subdivision. One afternoon, I watched her stop Mr. Live Alvarez while he was planting roses just to explain that the shade of red he picked felt visually aggressive. He stared at her for a full 5 seconds before asking if flowers had started committing crimes while he was asleep. Everyone laughed except Vanessa. She never laughed. She collected complaints the way some people collect stamps. At first, my little sign didn't seem to bother her. Then one afternoon, she came over while I was helping an elderly customer load her beagle into the back seat. Vanessa stood there with her arms folded until the customer drove away. Then she pointed directly at Emily's chalkboard. "You know," she said, "business advertising really doesn't belong in a residential neighborhood." I smiled because I honestly thought she was making conversation. "It's been there over a decade," I said. "County approved everything years ago." She gave me one of those smiles that never reaches the eyes. Just because something has been ignored doesn't mean it should continue. I remember staring at her for a second, wondering if she actually heard herself speak. "Well," I answered, "I guess it's a good thing nobody's complained." She looked right at me and said, "Not yet." Then she turned around and walked home. I should have realized that wasn't a casual remark. It was a promise. 3 days later, I found an envelope taped to my front door from the HOA. Someone had filed a formal complaint claiming my business sign violated neighborhood appearance standards and negatively affected surrounding property values. I laughed when I read it because it sounded ridiculous. Then I reached the bottom of the page where it said I had 72 hours to remove the sign and pay a $250 fine, or additional penalties would begin accumulating weekly. Suddenly it wasn't funny anymore. I attended the next HOA meeting carrying copies of every permit I'd ever received. I expected a reasonable conversation. Instead, Vanessa sat in the front row smiling like she'd already won. One board member barely glanced at my paperwork before saying, "We're simply enforcing community standards." I asked which standard prohibited a legally permitted business from displaying a small decorative sign on private property. Nobody answered directly. Danessa finally spoke up. Our neighborhood should look residential, not commercial. I looked around the room and noticed 3 different houses displaying contractor signs from ongoing renovations, political yard signs from the recent election, and 2 realtor signs advertising open houses. Apparently, only my sign threatened civilization. Walking back to my truck that night, I wasn't angry anymore. I was curious, because something about the entire situation felt incomplete. I had lived there too long to believe the story ended with a $250 fine over a birthday gift. Somewhere underneath all of this, I had a feeling there was a piece everyone else had forgotten. And when I got home, I walked straight into my office, opened an old filing cabinet that hadn't been touched in years, and started looking for the original documents from when I bought the property. I spent the next 2 evenings surrounded by dusty folders, faded survey maps, and paperwork I hadn't looked at since the day I bought the house. Most people close a real estate transaction, throw everything into a box, and never think about it again. Apparently, I was one of those people, until a woman with too much free time decided a chalkboard was a threat to society. Around 9 o'clock on the second night, I found the original closing packet. Buried behind the warranty deed was a folded subdivision plat almost the size of my dining room table. I spread it out carefully, grabbed a flashlight because the print was tiny, and started tracing property lines the way I imagined surveyors had done 25 years earlier. That's when I noticed something I'd completely forgotten. Running along the outer edge of my lot was a narrow strip of pavement connecting the overflow guest parking area to the neighborhood clubhouse. It wasn't owned by the HOA. It wasn't common property either. The document identified it as a recorded commercial ingress and access easement attached exclusively to my parcel because decades before my neighborhood existed, that section had been planned as part of a small roadside business that was never built. The subdivision changed. The neighborhood replaced the old proposal. But somehow that easement had survived every revision. I must have read the paragraph 5 times before my heart started beating faster. I wasn't a lawyer, so I refused to get excited too early. The next morning, I called an old client named Richard Collins. His golden retriever, Winston, had been coming to me for years, and Richard happened to be one of the most respected real estate attorneys in Williamson County. When I explained everything, he laughed softly and said, "Daniel, don't touch anything until I see the documents." 2 hours later, he walked into my kitchen carrying a yellow legal pad and left 45 minutes later grinning in a way attorneys usually don't. "Well," he said while gathering his papers, "your neighbor picked an interesting hill to die on." I asked the question that had been sitting in my head all morning. "Am I reading this correctly?" He nodded. "You are. That easement predates the HOA by more than 15 years. It was properly recorded, never extinguished, and still grants commercial access associated with your licensed business. More importantly," he tapped the survey with his pen, "you've been letting everyone use this area for free, purely out of kindness." I shrugged. "It's just easier that way. Visitors park there during birthday parties. Contractors leave their trucks there. Guests use it during pool weekends. Nobody's ever abused it." Richard smiled. "Kindness isn't a legal obligation." Those 5 words stayed with me all afternoon. Kindness isn't a legal obligation. I'd spent 11 years making life easier for everyone because that's what neighbors do. Nobody asked permission to use that pavement. I never charged anyone. I never complained when someone's guests blocked part of it for an afternoon. But kindness depends on mutual respect. The moment someone starts using your generosity as a weapon against you, it stops being generosity. By Monday morning, Richard had prepared everything I needed. We weren't suing anyone. We weren't threatening anyone. We simply recorded a clarification of use consistent with the existing easement. Then I ordered 4 professionally made signs that complied with every county regulation. Private commercial access, customer parking only, unauthorized vehicles subject to parking fees and enforcement. The signs looked surprisingly ordinary, almost boring. Then came the part Richard suggested almost as a joke. "If you're restricting access," he said, "you'll need a way to distinguish customers from everyone else." I raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" He smiled. "A parking system." 3 days later, a small electronic payment kiosk appeared beside the entrance to the access strip. It accepted credit cards, mobile payments, even printed receipts. The fee was simple, $15 per hour for non-customer parking. My clients entered a validation code I gave them during appointments and parked free. Everyone else paid. The first morning hardly anyone noticed. Then Friday arrived. Vanessa and her husband hosted one of their famous backyard gatherings. They loved entertaining. Luxury SUVs lined the street. Caterers came. Friends arrived carrying wine bottles and folding chairs. Since they'd always used the pavement beside my property, every guest naturally parked there again without thinking twice. Around dinner time, my phone buzzed with payment notifications. $15, $30, $45, $60. Every hour, the kiosk quietly kept collecting fees while people laughed beside the swimming pool, completely unaware they were paying for the privilege of ignoring signs they'd never bothered reading. The following afternoon, Vanessa came marching across the street holding 3 printed receipts. "What is this?" she demanded before she'd even reached my porch. I glanced down. "Looks like parking receipts." "This is outrageous." "Is it?" I asked calmly. She shoved the papers toward me. "My guests paid over $300 yesterday." "Yes," I answered. "Looks like they stayed quite a while." Her face turned bright red. "You can't charge people for parking in our neighborhood." "Actually," I pointed toward the survey Richard had recommended I keep in a waterproof folder near the front door, "I can charge people for parking on my commercial easement." She stared at me. "That's HOA property." I handed her a certified copy of the recorded plat. Page 6, highlighted in yellow. "Feel free to take your time." She refused to look at it. "This is retaliation." I smiled politely. "No. Retaliation would have been filing complaints about your pool equipment being visible from the street. This is simply ending a courtesy that apparently wasn't appreciated." She stormed away, muttering something about calling the HOA attorney. I honestly expected that would be the end of it. Instead, things became almost comical. On Monday morning, her husband's roofing contractor parked his pickup on the access strip while unloading materials. 4 hours later, the parking enforcement company I had legally contracted with placed a wheel boot on the truck after unpaid fees accumulated. Removing the boot cost another $225. I watched the foreman read the invoice twice before looking over at my house. I walked outside carrying 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. "Nothing personal," I said. "You probably want to build a homeowner." He laughed so hard he nearly spilled the coffee. "Buddy, I absolutely am." Word spread faster than I expected. Within a week, every contractor, delivery company, and landscaping crew entering the subdivision knew exactly where not to park unless they wanted to pay. My regular grooming customers loved it because they always found open spaces reserved for them. Ironically, my little business became easier to operate than it had ever been. Vanessa, meanwhile, was losing her mind. Every few days she found someone else complaining about another parking receipt. Her sister paid $90 during a baby shower. Her cousin ignored the signs during a graduation party and accumulated $150. Even the food truck she'd hired for a neighborhood fundraiser had to move after receiving an automated warning. She began telling everyone I was exploiting legal loopholes. I quietly reminded anyone who asked that I'd allowed free parking for over a decade until someone decided my daughter's birthday sign deserved punishment. The neighborhood slowly stopped seeing me as the villain. People started asking a different question instead. Why had Vanessa pushed so hard over something so harmless? 2 weeks later, the HOA called a special meeting. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. Their attorney attended. Richard sat beside me. Vanessa still looked confident walking into the room. But confidence fades quickly when lawyers start opening binders instead of opinions. The HOA president cleared his throat and announced they wished to review the previous enforcement action concerning my business sign. Richard politely slid copies of the easement across the table along with county approvals, business licenses, historical zoning records, and one particularly uncomfortable timeline showing my business had operated legally for 11 years before Vanessa ever purchased her home. Then, he calmly asked a single question. "Can someone explain the legal authority allowing the HOA to impair a recorded commercial easement established before these covenanters existed?" Nobody answered, not because they didn't want to, because they couldn't. I watched board members quietly exchange nervous looks while Vanessa sat frozen beside them, suddenly realizing this had never really been about a chalkboard. She had started a fight, assuming nobody would bother checking the paperwork, and unfortunately for her, paperwork has a way of remembering things people forget. The room stayed quiet for what felt like an entire minute. Nobody wanted to be the first person to admit what had happened, because once someone said it out loud, there wasn't any way to pretend this had been a simple misunderstanding anymore. The HOA attorney finally cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at the board instead of at me. "The easement is valid," he said. "It predates the governing documents. and the association has no authority to interfere with rights granted under that recorded instrument. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't raise his voice. But those 20 words completely changed the room. Vanessa leaned forward so quickly her chair scraped across the floor. There has to be something you can do, she insisted. He's hurting the neighborhood. The attorney didn't even look at her. He's exercising a recorded property right. He's charging people to park, after allowing free access for more than a decade. She opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. For the first time since she'd moved into our neighborhood, she had run into something she couldn't intimidate, complain about, or vote away. Facts don't care who has the loudest opinion. Richard quietly slid one final document across the table. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't even a threat. It was simply a formal request that the HOA immediately withdraw the violation notice, cancel every related fine, and acknowledge that my licensed home business remained fully compliant under county regulations. The attorney read it once, nodded almost imperceptibly, then turned back toward the board. That would be my recommendation. Less than 15 minutes later, the same board that had confidently fined me $250 voted unanimously to rescind the citation. No apology, no speech about fairness, just a motion, a second, and a quick vote before anyone had to make eye contact with me. Honestly, I wasn't disappointed. An apology from people protecting their own mistakes wouldn't have meant much anyway. What mattered was that Emily's chalkboard never should have come down in the first place. The next morning, I carried it into my garage, sanded away years of weathered paint, and called my daughter. She drove over that Saturday with the same little paint kit she'd used years earlier. We spent the afternoon laughing, drinking iced tea, and repainting every tiny paw print by hand. She asked if I wanted to change the message after everything that had happened. I smiled and shook my head. Just add one more line. She looked at me. What line? I grinned. Parking available. Ask inside. She laughed so hard she almost dropped the paintbrush. By Monday morning, the sign was back exactly where it had always belonged, looking brighter than it had in years. The parking kiosk stayed too. That surprised a lot of people. Several neighbors assumed I'd remove it after winning the dispute. But here's the thing. Nobody ever asked me to. My grooming clients appreciated having guaranteed parking. Delivery drivers knew exactly where they could and couldn't stop. Contractors simply parked somewhere else if they didn't want to pay. Within a couple of weeks, the system became normal. Funny how quickly people adapt once they realize the rules apply equally to everyone. During those 31 days, the kiosk collected $4,820. After expenses, taxes, and maintenance, I donated a portion to the county animal rescue where I'd adopted my first dog years earlier. Somehow that felt like the right ending. Vanessa eventually stopped organizing oversized parties. She stopped walking across the street to inspect everyone else's property. She even stopped attending most HOA meetings after realizing people had begun asking uncomfortable questions whenever she stood up to speak. I never celebrated her embarrassment. I never mocked her. In fact, a few months later, we passed each other while collecting our mail. She gave a small nod. I nodded back. Neither of us said anything. Sometimes silence says everything that needs saying. Looking back now, I don't think the story was ever really about a parking kiosk or a chalkboard. It was about something much simpler. Communities only work when respect flows both directions. Rules exist for a reason, but so do property rights. The moment someone starts believing rules only apply to other people, sooner or later, reality reminds them otherwise. I still groom dogs every week. Emily's sign is still sitting between those lavender pots. Customers still stop to refill the water bowl before heading home. Life is peaceful again. Maybe even more peaceful than before. Because every time I walk outside and see that little chalkboard, I'm reminded that standing your ground doesn't always require yelling, revenge, or courtroom drama. Sometimes all it takes is patience, good records, and the willingness to read page 6 before making assumptions. Now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my shoes, would you have removed the sign just to avoid the conflict? Or would you have done exactly what I did and quietly let the law speak for itself? And what about Vanessa? Was she simply trying to protect the neighborhood? Or did she let pride and the need for control blind her to basic fairness? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I'd genuinely like to hear where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's ever had that one neighbor who thought they owned the whole neighborhood. You never know. They might recognize a familiar face in this one.